There's no doubt about it. The source of the darkness is in Helheim, and the goddess Hela holds his soul there. Her dear beloved, Dillian.
With more and more game developers dropping single-player campaigns in favor of the more lucrative online multiplayer era, it's usually very refreshing when a title is released offering an exclusively single-player experience. Does Ninja Theory's Hellblade offer fans of the dying narrative-driven experience a complete single-player package, or does it end up sacrificing gameplay for graphical fidelity? A quick warning, this review will feature minor in-game spoilers that are actually very necessary to gauge whether or not this is the type of game for you. With that all being said, let's take a look at Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice. Starting with the story, Senua's Sacrifice is a dark fantasy action adventure inspired by Norse mythology and follows, well, Senua, a young female picked warrior on her quest to Helheim. On a personal note, I wanted to state that a tale this steeped in Norse lore is not necessarily something I would normally seek out. The slam dunk that was Thor Ragnarok aside, Norse mythology is just not something I find that captivating. Fortunately for me, Senua's journey merely uses Norse mythology as a setting for the actual narrative of Hellblade. And here's where we have to kind of get into spoiler territory, as Hellblade's actually about a young woman dealing with severe psychosis in the early 8th century. Somewhat borrowing a page from 2015's film The Witch, Hellblade centers around a young woman struggling with a severe mental illness in a time that didn't really cater to the affliction, to say the least. So, while Norse mythology may be present throughout Hellblade's campaign, it's merely a setting used to amplify the absolute horror of its protagonist's mental illness. While absolutely not for everyone, Hellblade's story was a deeply moving and emotionally draining experience that will stay with me for a very long time. Moving on to the gameplay, so the game absolutely has no HUD and instead uses Senua's voices in her head to simultaneously haunt and aid the player through her quest to Helheim.
To break his magic seal.
Show me what you have seen, Truth. Look how much it's changed.
This definitely was a brilliant move on the devs' part because the result of the lack of any sort of traditional HUD definitely immersed me into the world they created for Hellblade. Very rarely was I reminded that I was actually playing a video game. So what kind of video game is Hellblade? It's actually a really difficult game to put in any one genre. At first glance, it seemed to function as a walking simulator of sorts with some light puzzle elements, but then somewhat early on in the game, the player is introduced to Hellblade's simple but very intense battle sequences. So, Senua's path is regularly sealed by various doors and gates that will have 1 to 3 glyphs on them, and you will have to navigate around the environment in search of these patterns in the environment to advance. It was executed pretty well for the most part. I did run into a handful of 10 to 20 minute stretches where I was looking for something and scratching my head, but I'd already attempted it and the game just simply didn't register it. Pretty good. So on to Hellblade's battle system. The setup for these encounters reminded me quite a bit of the Infinity Blade series for mobile devices, which sounds pretty awkward, but it's actually really brilliant in its practice. It is the standard block, dodge, light attack, heavy attack affair, with Senua focusing automatically on whichever enemy is closest in proximity to her. The very first battle in particular was insanely intense, as the lack of any sort of in-game HUD had me absolutely panicking as to what to do. It was truly an anxiety-inducing encounter that the game somewhat masterfully was able to recreate with each subsequent battle. The intensity of these confrontations is made even more nerve-wracking with the introduction of a permadeath system right out of the gate. So if Senua falls too many times in battle, the game will simply end and the player will have to restart from the very beginning. While it is not the deepest, overall the battle system is intense, satisfying, and usually provides a welcomed break from the game's puzzle solving.
I know what she's thinking. I hear her thoughts. It's not too late to get into the boat and go back. No one will judge her. No one will ever know. Oh, she heard us. There's no going back.
You can't do it.
Senua pushes away a world that conspired to cause so much suffering. There's nothing to go back to, and worse to look forward to. Why don't you join us?
One of Hellblade's more laudable attributes would be the game's sound design. While the game more or less requires you to wear headphones, not doing so would be absolutely robbing yourself of a truly memorable audio experience that helps bring Senua's mental illness to the foreground right where it belongs. Whether laughing at her or screaming at her about an enemy, Senua always has 100 voices in her head telling her what to do, what not to do, teasing her, tormenting her, etc. These voices are present throughout Hellblade and can drive you sort of mad, which is kind of the point. Other voice performances in the game are expertly tuned as well and do a great job to keep you in the fantasy. Some of the more sinister voice work is truly stuff of nightmares, and unfortunately will have you looking around to make sure whatever you just heard isn't in the room with you while you're playing. Masterfully done and a remarkable auditory achievement, but again, perhaps not for everyone. The music in Hellblade is mostly good and consists of, I guess, haunting Nordic tracks would be the best way to describe it. There are a few standout songs too in particular. One was sort of like a metal Nordic jam that played during a boss fight. It made it super intense and pretty cool. It took me a second to kind of get into it, and then I was fully on board. And then the track that plays during kind of the game wrapping up during the last fight scene was so powerful and such a good choice. Really good stuff, and it really moved me. Something I do have to point out is the song that plays during the ending credits is god-awful. It's as if Ninja Theory wanted to remind you, hey, you just beat the game we made, and here's a song for you. Unfortunately, the song was a terrible choice as it does not match the mood of the game at all, nor the conclusion of the game. It sort of felt like the Shawshank Redemption was wrapping up, and when the end credits started to roll, Blink-182 started to play, completely out of left field and did not belong in the game whatsoever. In conclusion, Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice is one of the most horrifying and emotionally draining experiences I've had holding a controller. But at the same time, it was able to tell me a beautiful story that's going to stay with me for years to come. Like Senua herself perhaps, the game does somewhat struggle with an identity crisis with its shifting gameplay mechanics, but they all seem to fit the overall experience in my case, and they just really work for me. While it is terrifying subject matter, and it certainly is not for everyone, I personally think that these 7 to 8 hours are some of the best on the console, and for $29.99 is an absolute steal. Anyway, thanks for watching the video, and I hope you have a great day.
In your sword still beats our heart. You fought for love unspoilt by your darkness within. You fought for your dreams. Now there's no way to win. In the head of his corpse lies the seat of his soul. So must carry his vessel.